Hoo, 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 hoo. And he 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 he. Ooh hee ha ho ho hee. Well, I am back. Aloha. And we're going to wrap things up with Victorian era. Now, from where I left off, well, let's go to the table of contents. Let's go right here. I already talked about that. And this one, I know about it, but let me just skim through it with y'all. Railroad, or railways, not railroads. A central development during the Victorian era was the rise of a rail transport. The new railways all allowed goods, raw materials, and people to be moved out, rapidly facilitating trade and industry. Just because there was not really any roads due to not being cars around. Not that a lot of people own cars, but just that it was not invented until later of the Victorian era. And even then, with Europe, there was not much of an automotive industry that yet. Um, the concept of a road that became really big. Um, Other than that, railways also shows how the use of trains and other transportation relies on that. So, thinking about it, like medieval roads in Europe, um, calls to the future, roads are made again, but obviously for really big transportation vehicles, especially for cars. So, what goes around comes around. I guess in the way of transportation, commerce, or really just when it comes to human invention. The financing of railways became an important specialty. Specialty of London's financiers. They were saying ownership, even through turning over management to locals. Then going through here, and then other engineers and businessmen needed to create the financing and a railway system were available. Yes, by 1825, railways were commercially feasible, as demonstrated by George Stephenson, Stockton, and Darlington. They invented and improved thousands of mechanical devices and developed the science of civil engineering to build railways, tunnels, and bridges. The canal companies unable and unwilling to upgrade their facilities to complete with railways used political power. Use political power to try to stop them. The different lines typically have exclusive territory has given compact size of Britain. By 1850, rates have fallen to a penny and ton of mile for coal as speeds Britain now had. The model of the world is well integrated. The railways directly or indirectly employed tens of thousands of engineers. Most important, they created a mindset of how technology could have been used in many different forms of businesses. Railways had a major impact on industrialization. By lowering transportation costs, they reduced costs for all industries moving supplies and finished goods, and they increased demand for the production of all the inputs needed for the railroad system itself. By 1880, they were 13,500 locomotives, which each carried 97,800 passengers a year, or 31,500 tons of freight. Or freight. Freight, freight. Freight, freight. Freight. And then, member of the Parliament, solicitor of the City of London, Charles Pearson. Alright, and Underground Railroad. The system was overbuilt, much too elaborate and expensive for the small amount of freight traffic it carried. Yes, but who saw their railways as the symbol of an industrial modernity? But one was not realized until a century or so later. Popularity of metro subways and stuff. Yeah. Now, let's get to public safety, health, and medicine. A gas network for lighting and heating was introduced in the 1880s. The model town of Solitaire was founded along with others as well as a planned environment with good sanitation and many civic, educational, recreational facilities, although it lacked a pub, which was regarded as the focus of dissent because people need their fix. In modern days, at least in the US, their fix would be coffee shops like Starbucks. But back then, they need to have their drink from the pub. Although initially the pub in the early... Alright, let me actually read this. Yeah, comes with the invention of... The invention of incandescent gas mantle in the 1890s greatly improved light output and ensured survival as late as the 1960s, when they started becoming more environmentally friendly. Thanks to advances in science, especially microbiology, paving the way of the germ theory of disease. This was during the height of the Industrial Revolution. Urbanization occurred at a frantic pace. Good sir. Let me actually try the accent. After studying previous outbreaks, physician John Snow drew the conclusion that chloride was a waterborne disease. When the 1854 broke out, and I'm going for transatlantic accent, and stick with that. Snow mapped the locations of the cases in Soho, London, and found that they centered around a well he deemed contaminated. He asked that the pump's handle be replaced, after which the epidemic petered out. Snow also discovered that households whose water supplies came from companies that used the Thames downstream as the sewers had flown into the river were 14 times more likely to die from chloride. He thus recommended boiling water before use. Understanding sanitation and all that jazz. Sanitation reforms, 1848 and 1869 when it comes to infrastructure, then the sewage system in London. Joseph Bazalgette in 1854. Okay, chief engineer, major achievements. Gotcha. And John Simon, a chief medical officer of the General Board of Health, secured funds for research into various common infectious diseases at the time, including cholera, diphtheria, smallpox, and typhus. By the mid-century, the stethoscope became an oft-used device, and designs of the microscope have advanced enough for scientists to closely examine pathogens. The pioneering work of French microbiologist Louis Pasteur from the 1850s earned widespread acceptance for the germ theory of disease. And yeah, this is the same person who created the Pasteur method when it comes to foods. That is one of the things he did. The pasteurization of foods and stuff. But, maybe life was actually medicine. Yeah. Infectious related deaths fell noticeably as a result. As the British Empire expanded, Britons found themselves facing novel climates and contagions. They were actively researching tropical diseases. In 1898, all proved the mosquito was responsible for spreading malaria. Yeah, and then further... Yeah, let me actually just skim through all this, see what's up the up. Okay, yeah, it talks more about what's going on with other people helping out with diseases and outbreaks. Guys, yeah, going back to microbiology and understanding germ theory, they're actual clean people and helping people treat diseases that have been existed for almost forever in their time. So tackling all that is just phenomenal. Alrighty. Yet, despite the aforementioned medical advances, the mortality rate fell only marginally. Were being driven out. Others, such as sexually transmitted diseases, made themselves felt, which comes to here. Moral standards. Victorian morality was a surprising new reality. The changes in moral standards and actual behavior across the British were profound, historian Harold Parkin wrote. Between 1780 and 1850, the English ceased to be one of the most aggressive, brutal, rowdy, outspoken, ruthless, cruel, and bloodthirsty nations in the world and became one of the most inhibited, polite, orderly, tender-minded, prudish, and hypercritical. Historians continue to debate various causes of this dramatic change, as is Briggs, emphasizes a strong reaction against the French Revolution, and need to focus the British efforts on their defeat and not diverged by pleasurable sin. So pretty much the French Revolution and its thoughts and changes throughout the society. Yeah, sure, whatever. But it is so interesting realizing that the French Revolution and then Napoleon's reign was around the same century as Queen Victoria's reign. And understanding how the 1800s was pretty different compared to later on, because the Gilded Age, the Industrial Revolution, leading to society really changing. But yeah, they're dealing with effects, conservative Europe and all that jazz, with trying to have some conservative thoughts versus liberal revolutionary thoughts around the continent. So yeah, they were against that. Historians agree that the middle class does not profound high personal moral standards. Yeah, but that goes to show how different classes have different ideas on themselves. By contrast, in the 21st century, Britain, nearly half of the all children are born outside marriage, and 9 in 10 newlyweds have been cohabiting, which means they've just been living together without marriage, which, is still a pretty conservative thing in today's world. But it does show that it's starting to become a norm rather than an exception to all classes, other than the high aristocratic class in British society, which still values conservative ideals. Crime, prison, and police. Crime was getting exponentially worse. There were 4,065 arrests for criminal offenses in 1805, tripling to 14,437 in 1835, and doubling to 31,309 in 1842 in England and Wales. But damn, later in the 1870s and 80s, it just becomes really, really stacked. But it does show that during this time, it has been increasing more and more. Even though the Industrial Revolution has not had its big milestone yet, it's still changing towards it. After all, many of the earliest inventions that were known for factory workers and larger agriculture was around the late 1700s. And yeah, starts bringing that. 18th century British criminology have emphasized severe punishment. Slowly, capital punishment was replaced by transportation, first to the American colonies and then to Australia, penal colonies pretty much, and especially by long-term incarceration in newly built prisons, as one historian points out. I'm going to try the transatlantic accent. Public and violent punishment which attacked, public and violent punishment which attacked the body of branding, whipping, and hanging was given way to reformation of the mind of the criminal by breaking his spirit and encouraging him to reflect on his shame before labor and religion transformed his character. End quote. Crime rates went up, leading to calls for harsher measures to stop the flood of criminals released under the penal servitude system. The reaction for the committee was set up under the Commissioner of Prisons, Colonel Edmund Frederick Duquesne, was to increase the minimum sentences to floor many offenses that with deterred principles of hard labor, hard fare, and a hard bed. End quote. As the prisons grew more numerous, they became more deprived. And yeah, we're further counts here, but Victorian era penal transportation to Australia was falling out of use since it did not reduce crime rates. This would be later on, and then further to it comes through here, and they started having the prison population to a modern prison. Alright, the Bolts-3 system after 1908 was organized to refrain Young Offenders and Children Act of 1908 prohibited imprisonment under age 14 and strictly limited that to the ages of 14 to 16. The principal reform was Sir Evelyn Ruggles Rice, the chair of Prison Commission. And the infamous Whitechapel murders prompted the composer of the serial killer Jack the Ripper was committed in London in 1888 during the mid to late chapter of the Victorian era. Alrighty. Oh yeah, also that does show how it's pretty confusing. Well, the Victorian's reign is just different, but it just shows how things change. Also, when I scroll down, I forgot where I was. Where's my position? Yeah, it should be here. Alright, so you got prostitution. During the Victorian England, prostitution was laid as the great civil social evil by the clergyman, a major news organization by many feminists viewed. Yeah, just like that. By many feminists view prostitution as a means of economic independence for women. Estimates the number of prostitutes in London in the 1850s vary widely, but in a landmark study, prostitution, William Acton reported an estimation of 8,600 prostitutes in London alone in 1857. The different views on the prostitution have made it difficult to understand its history. Alright, let's go further here. Yeah, it talks about the feminist point of view, but it also does show how the changing tides of women having a form of income to do something that was sort of frowned upon, becoming a bit accepted, or at least there is acknowledgement in the public about it, also when it comes to using services. But it does show the situation in women during that time, especially in the city, have to deal with, especially when it comes to the Whitechapel murders. And yeah, well, if you ask. Orphaned or half-orphaned women were more likely to turn to prostitution as a means of income, while overcrowding in urban cities and the amount of job opportunities for females were limited. Yeah, although many were assumed the pimps controlled and exploited these prostitutes, some women managed their own clientele and pricing. It's evident that women were exploited in the system, yet Woolwitz say that prostitution will also their opportunity to gain social and economic independence. To an extent, but that does show the rise of crime organization. And I mean, that's something more in the US that I understand than in the UK. Because what? There's a great understanding of that history due to in the U.S. and during the 1920s because of Prohibition. But yeah, I would say that's a growing thing. The rise of a type of new crime after criminology and trying to look at the Whitechapel murders because of supposedly the Jack the Ripper coming through and terrorizing places really brought into modern criminal investigation to work. I mean, honestly, that's what made me so interested with Jack the Ripper. It's the world that impacted because of their presence to what we have now when it comes to criminal investigations, to protecting the civilian population and understanding how to handle criminology in the future. It's fair to say the arguments for and against prostitution vary greatly from being perceived as a mortal sin or a desperate decision to an independent choice. And then it follows contagious diseases due to, and this is part of health safety when it comes to diseases spreading around. After all, they're finally acknowledging that it is a concern. So it is helping people's books. The book Prostitution Action by Dr. William Action included detailed reports on his observation of prostitutes in hospitals they were placed if they were under a venereal disease. Action believed that prostitution was a poor institution, but it was a result of the supply and demand for it. Alright, while he referred to prostitutes as wretched women, alright, he did note how it acts unfairly criminalize women and ignore the men involved. So yeah, William Action has some bias, but it's fairly easy acknowledging something different other than just ignoring it. So it is a controversial issue that to understand the point. It was controversial back then as it is now. Now under the events here, let's just shift over. From 1832, passage of the first Reform Act. Let's go with what it is. Reform Act is most commonly used for legislation passed in the 19th century and early 20th century to enfranchise new groups of voters and to retrieve seats in the House of Commons of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. So allow people to have more representation when it comes to voting, more leniency. It's more efficient to vote now from 1832. So around the beginning of the Victorian era. Then 33, Oxford moving the session of Queen Victoria to the throne. First Opium War. February's Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, Saulsfield. I keep on butchering his name. I keep on forgetting her husband's name is Alfred. No, Albert. Now you know why I keep forgetting. It's Albert. And New Zealand becomes a British colony, 1840, then goes through here. 1855, Irish potato famine. And then repealed corn laws, open era of free trade. Oh yeah, I also understand that I'm skimming through some pictures. I could just refer back because that's something, I am working on with how I should tackle and speak up. So if there's suggestions, I'm open to it. That's what I always try to do. Try to keep stuff, or try. Restoration of the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the England and Wales. Alright, Great Expedition, the World's Fair, Crimea War, just a big conflict, the Concert Era. So, an era of peace in Europe really meant a good region war against Russia and other European alliances. Sure, why not? 1861, death of Prince Albert. So this leads to the second phase of the Victorian era, since there's three. Then Lewis Carroll's Alice Adventures of One Rise published. Alrighty, the Constitution Act. Purchase Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal, 1875. Yeah, then British troops began the occupation of Egypt by taking the Suez Canal, 1882, 1886. Alright, we're passing the first Irish Home Rule Bill, 1888. This year, contract workers, murders of Middle 5, prostitutes in the streets of London. Yeah, things have been going on around the British Empire too. 1899, the Second Boer War is fought between the British Empire and the two independent Boer republics. The Boers finally surrendered, and the British annexed the Boer republics. So pretty much the Dutch settlers, farmers, and such. Boer referring to farmers in Dutch. Then 1901, the death of Victoria sees the end of this era, and the accession of her eldest son Edward begins the Edwardian era. Which, now it's more like the 1900s. Trying to be curious of what is that era is there in the US. We really don't follow eras when it comes to monarchy, but rather just presidencies. And to an extent, when it comes to generations nowadays, I don't know what back then. You could say wars, like during the American Civil War time, we call it just the Civil War times. When it came to that, like pre, but there's that. But yeah, we finally finished it. Now, I could go further to a Warring era. I could actually skim through it. Just skim, because from what I remember a while ago, is the reason why we started this is I was interested with learning a bit more about the Regency era, which was before the Victorian era. But under this context, I figured, let me just learn more of the Victorian era. That's something I wanted to share and to read about. And yeah, we finally did, and as I said, we can talk about the Regency era. Now, I just want to skim through and see if there's anything I want to go through. Just the pictures, yeah, for the sake of it. Workman leaving Platt's work, Solomon 900. So it does look like me suggesting that I should just go back to the pictures after I finish everything. Yeah, I think that's the best way to suit. British and Australian officers in South Africa during the Second World War. Let's see the pictures. Dommer Megan in Ireland, 1899. The author of Constance Wilde, wife of Oscar Wilde, pictured his son Cyril, Cyril, in 1889. Following the Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War in 1896, the British proclaimed the protectorate over the Ashanti Kingdom. And then it shows conquest in the British Empire, the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, and to further India and Lord Kenyon, last male approaches in Saipan in 1848, First Opium War. Yeah, it just shows the great events here. Rather than in prostitution, there's nothing. Crimes, nothing. Now let's go to railroads. So yeah, briefly talked about this. Bruno's close to Sebastian Bridge and Bristol in the section. Railroads charge communication society dramatically, along with Lincoln by Gloucester Rails. Burroughs' depiction of Paddington Railroad Station in London. So, yep. And construction of the Metropolitan Railroad, 1861. So, all the way back then. That's when they started realizing that the use of railways are important. And, yeah. I got this picture of Joseph Thomson Clover demonstrating the chloroform apparatus he invented in 1862 to make dentistry pretty bearable instead of just yanking people's teeth, which was so painful, and that it discouraged so many people with dental practice that they end up just suffering consequences with their teeth. So no more wooden teeth anymore. They could actually have teeth, at least. And yeah, that's pretty much just it. And I want to just go through, yeah, what they also recommend. Historiography of the United Kingdom, British Empire, yeah, Victorian fashion, Victorian morality, Victorian literature. There's a lot of Victorian stuff in this subject, other than this large wiki page. Neo-Victorian. Alright. Victorian. And good old, we have the Gilded Age. Speaking of which, yeah, let's just go to the Edwardian era. I want to skim through if they was suggested something else in the US. Yeah, that's the progressive era for the United States around the same time. Okay, so that is just what it calls. Let's see what's the time slot. Ah, okay. Yeah, that explains it. We don't talk about this era much because due to confusion around the 1900s, people are a bit strange. What we have learned is because of the Spanish-American War leading to a bunch of territories in the U.S. From the defeat from Spain, defeat that Spain had. Yeah, so the progressive era. Oh yeah, if you're also interested, it's also progressive because that's when women's suffrage became a big thing, and then later on paving a way to prohibition, because prohibition has a history in the U.S. due to women who were for the big suffrage movements were against abuse cases and corruption when it comes to alcohol, especially when it comes to husbands and fathers when it comes to public safety. That's one reason why they had prohibition. The fact that they had it, it's not great. But anyway, for the progressive era in the US, there's the Edwardian era in the UK. So let's go through here. 1901 to 1910. Alrighty. And then the Conservative Party, as long as it follows things up. Naval race of Germany. Women's suffrage, birth control, yeah, pretty much women's rights. social change and improve health, so pretty much when it comes to women and more of the public safety like they did before, but further with advancement of science and laws. Other than that, talks about the space fuel. I won't talk much about that because then we could get to the trend of talking about more about eras and stuff, and I figured that it would be better just to talk in a general sense. But next time, I'll finally tackle the Regency era. Other than that, aloha.